Music Technology Competency Test. To advance to the next level of music snobability, you must take the following quiz. Ready? Let's begin. Question 1. True or false? The development of today's cassette tape and videotape can be traced directly back to Adolf Hitler. The answer is true. Magnetic tape was a key part of Hitler's propaganda strategy. By taping speeches and running them on radio stations in two different distant cities, Hitler could fool the Allies by appearing he was in two places at once. Question 2. The world's most expensive turntable costs A. $20,000, B. $50,000, or C. $101,000. The answer is C. The Rockport System 3 Sirius model, with its magnetic induction motor, takes 6 months to build and sells for $101,000. And question 3. What is the exact and official recording capacity of a compact disc? 74 minutes and 42 seconds. Passing grade for this quiz is 100%. If you so much as hesitated for any of the preceding questions, you are required for the following 1-hour mandatory remedial class on the secret history of recorded music. Sit down! I said mandatory!
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
There's Pearl Jam with their tribute to the vinyl record that's Spin the Black Circle from their 1994 Vitalogy album. Welcome to the show. I'm Alan Cross, and we're going to call this program The Secret History of Recorded Music. Let's face it, we take so much for granted when it comes to music. We can get just about whatever we want, whenever we want it, and wherever we may happen to be. Behind this modern-day ability and convenience is some unbelievably fascinating history, and 99% of it has been lost to today's music fan. Trust me, if you want to be dazzled by some strange but true stuff in recorded music, you're going to want to stick around. For example, for this first segment, we're going to cover a little history by starting back at the beginning. 150 years ago, there was only one way to enjoy music. Let's think about this. You had to make it yourself, or you had to listen to someone else make it. Now think about that for just a second. There was no way to store music so that you could enjoy it at a later date. There was no way to document a performance except maybe on paper. The thought was you could no more capture music than you could keep lightning in a bottle. Sound was entirely in real time and forevermore in the present. But then, on December 6th, 1877, Thomas Edison walked into the offices of Scientific American magazine. He wanted to demonstrate a machine he called a phonograph. Sound could now be captured. And notice I said sound. Here's a fascinating thing that's been lost to history. Edison believed his phonograph should be used to record dictation and to preserve great speeches made by important people. See, Edison wasn't much of a music fan. He didn't see the point in recording music. Who would ever want to do that? Go play a piano or something. Edison, though, finally gave in, and his cylinders were soon used to preserve music, but only if he could audition those who wished to be recorded. But then Edison developed a terrible hearing problem, so that just about everyone who sang for him sounded shrill and awful and were given the big thumbs down. His taste in music became grossly distorted by a hearing issue that he wouldn't admit to having. Well, to those around him anyway. The only way Edison could really figure out what was being recorded was to examine the grooves on his cylinder with a magnifying glass. In other words, he tried to hear with his eyes. Not very accurate. Those who were turned away by Edison's bad ear went across the street to his rival, a German engineer named Emil Berliner, who believed sound should be stored not on a round cylinder, but on a rotating disc. And by the end of the 1920s, Edison was out of business, and Berliner's turntables were in charge. Now, who knows how we might get our music today if Thomas Edison hadn't been so stubborn about his hearing. Then again, be thankful Edison got bored and moved on, because his next invention after the phonograph was the electric light bulb. You want to hear something cool? This is a recording that would have been used in stores that sold Edison cylinder phonographs. The date on this is 1906.
I am the Edison phonograph, created by the great wizard of the New World to delight those who would have melody or be amused. I can sing you tender songs of love. I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter. I can transport you to the realms of music. I can call you to join in the rhythmic dance. I can lull the babe to sweet repose, or waken in the aged heart soft memories of youthful days. No matter what may be your mood, I am always ready to entertain you. When your day's work is done, I can bring the theater or the opera to your home. I can give you grand opera, comic opera, or vaudeville. I can give you sacred or popular music, dance, orchestra, or instrumental music. I can render solos, duets, trios, quartets. I can aid in entertaining your guests. When your wife is worried after the cares of the day and the children are boisterous, I can rest the one and quiet the other. I never get tired, and you will never tire of me, for I always have something new to offer. I give pleasure to all, young and old. I will go wherever you want me, in the parlor, in the sick room, on the porch, in the camp, or to your summer home. If you sing or talk to me, I will retain your songs or words and repeat them to you at your pleasure. I can enable you to always hear the voices of your loved ones, even though they are far away. I talk in every language. I can help you to learn other languages. I am made with the highest degree of mechanical skill. My voice is the clearest, smoothest, and most natural of any talking machine. The name of my famous master is on my body, and tells you that I am a genuine Edison phonograph. The more you become acquainted with me, the better you will like me. Ask the dealer.
Thomas Edison may have been one of the greatest inventors the world has ever seen, but he just didn't get this music thing, and he ended up losing the first great format war. See, in the early days, it was Edison's cylinder versus Emil Berliner's turntable. Edison spent years trying to prove that his technology was better than the rotating disc. But in 1913, he finally caved in and started making records. But even then, he insisted that his discs be different and thus incompatible with anything Emil Berliner made. By 1930, the Edison Phonograph Company was out of business. Edison may have invented recorded sound, but he was lousy at marketing it. Today, the news is filled with stories about the hard times faced by the music industry. This is not the first time things have seemed so dire. In fact, this is not even the greatest sales and revenue crisis the recording industry has ever seen. Today, they say the culprit is online file trading of MP3s. In the 1920s, the boogeyman was, believe it or not, radio. Radio started to take off in the early 1920s. By Christmas 1922, the free music you could get from a radio was killing the sales of phonographs and phonograph records. That same year, the American Department of Commerce decreed that broadcasting licenses would be given to radio stations only if they promised not to play recorded music. If a station wanted to play music, well, then they'd better have an orchestra of live musicians right there in the studio all the time. But even that didn't help the industry. Record sales that were 110 million copies in 1922 dropped to just 6 million 10 years later. By the time the Depression got rolling, the manufacture of record players had pretty much stopped. So no matter how grave today's news is, it sure ain't worse than the absolute darkest days of 1932. Oh, and it got worse. A guy by the name of James Cesar Petrillo led a 20-year campaign against, wait for it, recorded music, phonographs, jukeboxes, basically any mechanical device that could reproduce music. What was his problem? He was on the side of musicians. He believed that recorded music, especially recorded music played on the radio, was killing music and music jobs. Petrillo eventually became the president of the powerful American Musicians Union, and he actually led a year-long strike in 1942. Hardly any records were made in 1942, and because everyone was at war and because the raw materials for making records was in short supply, well, you know what? It really wasn't such a good idea to make a living as a musician during those years. Speaking of World War II, we've all heard the stories about how the Allies, especially the Americans, captured Nazi scientists and then put them to work. The result was that much of the world ended up benefiting from Nazi wartime technology. Think the American space program, or even computers and code breaking, thanks to the infamous Enigma machine. One such piece of Nazi work changed music forever. It was, believe it or not, recording tape. Once the war ended, it became obvious how far ahead the Germans were in certain areas, including sound research. This is because the Nazis had found a military application for sound. The research and development departments of 4 German companies worked on a device called the magnetophone, which was the world's first high-quality tape machine. See, the Nazis were big on propaganda. They used the magnetophone to record Hitler's speeches and then broadcast different speeches simultaneously from different cities. The Allies, who were listening in, were confused because it sounded like Hitler was in 2 or more places at the same time. It wasn't until the Allies invaded and took over several German military radio stations and captured a couple of magnetophones that they discovered what was going on. By the late 1940s, magnetic recording tape was being used everywhere, and here's how it changed music. For the first time in history, musicians didn't have to record all their parts at once. You didn't have to use the bulky machines that required direct recordings into fussy acetate discs. You could play the recording tape back immediately. You could add special effects, such as echo. And you could edit the music after the recording was done, something you couldn't do with the acetate discs. Nazi magnetic tape made the recording process cheaper, faster, and more accessible for everyone. And, of course, magnetic tape eventually opened up all kinds of creative possibilities. Here's the London Groove act Morcheeba with a 1996 track called Tape Loop.
Tape loop keeps on turning round forever. Patience, love is coming round for your pleasure. Wait now, no use trying to push. There's no need. People go against the grain with their greed. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. Focus, your mind will be strong. No distractions. Soak up wisdom all year long, and then take action. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more. I've been here before. It ain't gonna work no more.
Recording technology really took off after World War II, but one of the biggest developments wasn't a product of the military. It happened because of the music played at a dinner party in the fall of 1945. And believe me, this little party changed everything. The secret history of recorded music continues in just a second.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
In the autumn of 1945, Mac and Helen Morgan of Westport, Connecticut held a dinner party. And as all good hosts do, they provided some background music on their phonograph. It was mostly classical that night, Beethoven, Bach, and especially Brahms. One of the guests at the party was Dr. Peter Goldmark, who happened to be a big fan of Brahms, and he was mad. See, in 1945, the only thing you could play on a phonograph was a 78 RPM disc. 78s were made mostly of a brittle material called shellac, and they were noisy, they were scratchy, and worst of all, they were limited to storing a maximum of 4 minutes of music per side. So, if you wanted to play, Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1 in D minor, Opus 15, you had to get up every 4 minutes and either flip the record over or change it. And to get through the whole thing might take 10, 12 or more discs. This, thought Dr. Goldmark, was unacceptable. This was not how Brahms intended his music to be heard. So he vowed to do something about it. And he could, because Dr. Goldmark was not a medical doctor. He was an engineer. First, he did a little research. He discovered that 90% of all his favorite classical works were less than 45 minutes long. He then started to work on a system that would allow up to 25 minutes of uninterrupted listening. Dr. Goldmark hooked up with CBS Records, and in 1948, on a summer day at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, his new invention was unveiled. It was a 12-inch piece of vinyl that played not at 78 RPM, but 33 1/3 RPM. It was called the long-playing record, or the LP. Why 12 inches? No reason. Seemed to be a nice size and would fit on the turntables of the time. And why 33 1/3? No real magic reason. In 1931, RCA briefly dabbled in a 33 1/3 RPM disc for use in movie theaters. It ran about 20 minutes a side, which was about the same length as a standard movie reel. So for Dr. Goldmark, this seemed to be a good place to start. The long-playing record changed everything, obviously. We came to call it an album. And you know why we call it an album? Think back to that dinner party in 1945. All those separate 78 records had to be stored somewhere, so they were kept in paper sleeves that were bound together in a collection, in a book, that you could keep on a shelf. So instead of a photo album, you had a record album. And even after all those songs could be put onto just one record, we kept the name, album. So, today, if you buy a vinyl album, you should think back to that dinner party in 1945.
Pump up the volume. Pump up the volume. Pump up the volume, dance, dance.
When the drum beats go like this.
volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
The company that introduced the LP record in 1948 was CBS. Their rival was RCA. They hated each other. When the LP was ready, CBS chairman William Paley offered to share the technology with RCA. But the chief executive at RCA, a guy by the name of David Sarnoff, would have none of it. The great sound of the LP embarrassed him, so he ordered his engineers to come up with something better. Sarnoff didn't believe in putting songs together on one piece of vinyl. He liked individual songs on each side of a record, just like the old 78. So that's why, in early 1949, RCA released their answer to the LP. Codename, Madam X. The 7-inch single that played at 45 RPM. And instead of a nice small hole in the center, like an LP or a 78, it had this giant thing, made it look kind of like a donut. Ever wonder about that? Ever wonder why 45s have such a big hole? Because RCA also made turntables. They wanted to control the future development of turntables and in the process eradicate the LP. With a large hole, you couldn't play a 45 on the same turntable as a 33 1/3 LP. If you chose the 7-inch, you had to buy an RCA turntable. Of course, strategy didn't work. The industry adopted both the LP and the 7-inch, especially after rock and roll came along in the 1950s and the concept of the single was born. And ever since 1949, we've become accustomed to turntables with two speeds, 33 1/3 and 45. And now you know why. It was a battle of egos between David Sarnoff of RCA and William Paley of CBS.
From listening to records, I just knew what to do. I mainly taught myself. And, I did pretty well, except there were a few mistakes that I made that I have just recently cleared up. I'd like to just continue to be able to express myself as best as I can in the instrument. I feel like I have a lot of work to do still. I'm a student of the drums. And I'm also a teacher of the drums, too.
assimilates and feeds the body. So the crab feeds his astral brain, assimilating and distributing all he receives slowly until it becomes a part of him, part of him, part of him.
That's DJ Shadow, a guy who uses a turntable as a musical instrument. He's part of a group of music makers known as turntablists. And that's called Building Steam with a Grain of Salt from his 1998 record, Introducing. Now, you can still buy turntables, of course. They're still big with the DJ and turntablist crowd. But hardcore audiophiles still like them, too. They believe that the analog properties of vinyl produce a better listening experience than anything digital. If you're really serious about this kind of thing, you can buy yourself a Rockport System 3 Sirius. It's a turntable that takes 6 months to build by hand and weighs about 550 pounds. The record and the tone arm are suspended on a cushion of compressed air, and a magnetic induction motor keeps the record spinning on this cushion of air. So, would you like one? Sure. It's yours for $101,000. $101,000 for a turntable. And believe it or not, they've sold a couple dozen of them already. Today, we take the concept of stereo for granted. This is where you divide a recording into two channels, left and right. And outside of home theater, this is fine for most applications. See, we have two ears that help us gauge the direction and source of music and instruments and vocals, so all we need are a recording of the left perspective, mated to that of the right perspective, and it all comes together in the middle as stereo. There were experiments with something called two-eared listening at the Chicago World's Fair in 1933, but nobody cared. It took more than 20 years for the concept to be resurrected, and the thing that made it possible was that magnetic tape that the Allies captured from the Nazis. In 1955, the Ampex Corporation started selling big reel-to-reel tape recorders for home use. Along with the machines, they released a series of two-track recordings, two-track being stereo. It was the beginning of the home stereo revolution. Stereo records came along just before Christmas 1957. It took that long for the industry to develop a standard for cutting stereo grooves into vinyl on both LPs and 45s. And for the record, pardon the pun, this standard is called the Westrex system, and we still use it today.
My life is a stereo. How loud does it go? What songs do I know? Whatever happened to my plans? Whatever happened to life I thought I'd have? My life is a stereo, kinda cheaply made though. How bad does it show? Whatever did become of all my friends? Whatever happened to the likes of all of them? My life is a stereo. Turn me on and let's go. Turn me up louder. I'll scream as loud and clear as I can scream. And if you like what you're hearing, please hang on to me. I like being here, and I'm
The 1960s saw huge leaps in audio technology. The stereo record pretty much wiped out the pre-recorded reel-to-reel by the middle of the decade. Meanwhile, people were looking to take their music on the road. That, however, was proving to be a little more difficult than everyone thought. Dr. Goldmark, remember him? Convinced at least one automobile manufacturer to offer a record player as an option. This record player folded down from the dash and played special 16 RPM records. Of course, it didn't work very well, especially on bumpy roads. The guy who first figured out what to do was William Lear, the same guy who gave the world the private Lear jet. He designed a cartridge that contained a continuous loop of tape, and to play it, you just plugged it into a slot in a machine and enjoy. That was the birth of the 8-track, and it was called that because the tape featured 4 pairs of stereo tracks. 2 times 4 equals 8 tracks. In 1964, Lear had a meeting with Ford, and by 1966, 8 tracks were a luxury option on Ford cars. And by 1975, the 8-track accounted for 25% of sales of all pre-recorded music. But the 8-track's shortcomings killed it. You couldn't rewind an 8-track. And when the tape shifted from one set of stereo tracks to the next, it often happened in the middle of a song with a big ka-chunk and a few seconds of silence. Of course, that's not good. But it was still better than those stupid car turntables. And it was better than cassettes. Until the late 1970s, by the way, when the cassette took over. Once cassette started sounding better, and once the first Sony Walkman was introduced in 1979, the 8-track was doomed. This is from 1983. It's the first known tribute to the Walkman and the cassette. This is SSQ with Walkman On.
I just put my headphones on, turn it up and sing along. I don't care if you think that I'm singing out of key. Talk is cheap, don't talk to me. I can't hear a word they say. Close my eyes and fade away. See their faces moving, lost in concentration. Animation, animation. Listen to the sound. I got my Walkman on. I got my Walkman on. Walkman. If you have some headphones too, plug them into channel 2. We can play along together, laying in the sun, making love to music. Listen on the run. I got my Walkman on. I got my Walkman on. Walkman.
It wasn't all that long ago that the cassette was king. In 1986, pre-recorded cassettes outsold vinyl albums and CDs. And these days, well, when was the last time you saw a pre-recorded cassette in a record store? And what killed the cassette? Well, the CD, of course. Speaking of which, I have a couple of stories about the CD, including something called CD rot, which is a bad thing. More of the secret history of recorded music coming up.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
Back in the beginning, it was Edison and his wax cylinders. They gave way to Emil Berliner and his rotating discs. Discs evolved through the 78, the LP, and the 7-inch single. Then came the reel-to-reel tape, the 8-track, and the cassette. And in 1982, we went digital with the compact disc. Okay, a couple of facts about CDs. The maximum safe capacity of a CD is exactly 74 minutes and 42 seconds. Why? Well, think back to Dr. Goldmark and his favorite Brahms concerto. The head of Sony, one of the two companies that developed the CD, wanted a format that would allow him to listen to his favorite Beethoven symphony uninterrupted, and that just happened to be 74 minutes and 42 seconds. The standard CD is 5 inches across, but in 1987, Sony tried to introduce a 3-inch CD single. Didn't work. And you might remember that when CDs were first introduced, we were told that they promised perfect sound forever. That was because they were played with a laser instead of a needle, and they would never, ever, 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 ever wear out. Well, guess what? They do. It's a condition called CD rot. Check some of your older CDs. You might find some with little pinpoints of light shining through the disc. This indicates a deterioration of the data-carrying layer, and it's all the fault of the manufacturer. See, the thin layer of aluminum that reflects the light of the laser is separated from the CD label by a thin layer of lacquer. If that lacquer isn't applied just right, air can get in and oxidize the aluminum, eating it up kind of like rust. And it's not the underside of the disc where the problem appears. It's the label side. The underside is pretty tough. You have to dig some really deep scratches for things to get screwed up. But all it takes is a little rot on the label side, and the disc may die. So how do you prevent CD rot? By handling the discs carefully. Don't throw them around or stack them carelessly outside a jewel case. See, you don't want to upset that little layer of lacquer.
The thing you're listening to is called a compact disc. It's a method of conveying sound. It's square outside, inside it's round. The thing you're listening to is a digitally accurate reading of the numbers that make up different sounds in fact. It's the most technologically advanced sound reproduction known to man exist. It's a commercially viable sense. The thing you're listening to is called a compact disc. Every solo nuance of a tune is made available to you. The thing you're listening to is a high-tech team come true. Technically it works with laser beams, yet you can learn to use it easily. Throw your scarcity records in the trash. It's time to move out of the past in the profit analysis. Let's go!
Here's one more interesting fact about compact discs. Today's CDs might actually sound worse than the ones made back in the 1980s. And that's because of something called the loudness game. Have you noticed that some CDs just happen to be louder than others? It's not your imagination. Some record labels believe that people want loud CDs, and the only way to make that happen is to compress the music like crazy. The trade-off is that when you do that, you squish the dynamic range. There are fewer differences between the really heavy parts and the really delicate, quiet parts. The result is an assault on your ears that actually makes you tired if you listen too long. If you don't believe me, tell you what you do. Find a CD from the 1980s or early 1990s and compare it to a remastered version of the same CD that came out just recently. It's possible you will hear a rather large difference. To review, wax cylinder, rotating disc, the 78, the LP, the 45, reel-to-reel, 8-track, cassette, and CD. Today, of course, more and more music is going virtual, thanks to the MP3. The MP3 came from Germany, the Fraunhofer Institute. Karl-Heinz Brandenburg worked in their labs. And back in 1977, we began to tackle the problem of compressing music for faster, high-speed transfers over, say, a phone line. It took until 1989 before he worked out all the kinks. MP3 encoding software was then released as shareware, and when the Internet caught on with the general public, use of MP3 files exploded. But because it was shareware, Karl-Heinz made exactly $0 on his invention. The most important technological leap in recorded music since Edison and his wax cylinder, and the inventor got zip. Trivia time. What was the first song to be successfully encoded into an MP3? Answer seems to be a 1987 track called Tom's Diner by Suzanne Vega. Why? Because of its dynamic range, delicate vocals mixed with big beats, it was a great way to examine the compression algorithms of MP3 encoding software for glitches and flaws. Back with one final piece of secret history right after this.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
You may have guessed by now that I find the history of recorded music fascinating, all the stuff that went into making it possible for us to enjoy music today. I'm particularly fascinated by all the different formats to which we've been subjected. Now that we're seeing the CD start to be eased out in favor of virtual digital files like MP3s and Windows Media and Apple's ASX files, we'll tackle the whole concept of format wars on another program. Before we wrap up here, let me offer you this. You know the phrase, put a sock in it? Did you know that it had its roots in recorded music? See, early phonographs didn't have amplifiers. They had these big horns that amplified the music naturally. No amplifier meant no volume control. You couldn't turn it up, nor could you turn it down. But what if you were having a dinner party and you wanted some soft music in the background? Maybe the baby was sleeping, you wanted some soft music in the background, whatever. Thomas Edison's the one who came up with this low-tech solution. Each Edison diamond disc phonograph came with a ball of soft cloth. If you wanted to reduce the volume of your phonograph, you stuck this ball of cloth into the speaker horn. Hence the term, stick a sock in it. True story. Okay, let's stick a sock in this show. Technical production is by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.